It is late in the year 1973. Nixon is in the White House. There's still lead in gasoline. Most people don't know it, but in a small town in southern Wisconsin, a hobby that will one day have a player count in the tens of millions is being created. Hi, my name is Andrew, and today I'm talking about the evolution and history of D&D, from its origins in the early 70s to the successes and failures of TSR, and later acquisition by Wizards of the Coast. From the triumph of 3rd edition, the missteps of 4th, the emergence of 5th, all the way to the upcoming revisions in 2024. If you weren't already aware, Dungeons & Dragons is set to receive a revision in its core rules sometime in the next year. This is a pretty major event, so I thought I would take a break from the DM advice and talk about major changes that we know about, and some historical context. To quote the immortal Colville, it's been 50 years. They're still working on the rules? Wizards of the Coast has been playtesting new material for the revised core rules on DnDBeyond, and so between that and the revisions in Monsters of the Multiverse, we have a reasonable idea about what some of the major changes are going to be. As of Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, you can choose to put your racial bonuses, a +2 and a +1, into whatever stats you would like. This change reduces stereotyping and encourages players to play whatever they would like. This is going to be further revised so that it is now your background that gives you those starting bonuses. The term race will be entirely removed and replaced with species. I think this is a very accurate change, but a bit out of genre, so I wouldn't be too surprised if we instead see ancestry or maybe lineage. We've been using the term race since 1974, but I think it is not only inaccurate, but also has negative social baggage. Based upon the revisions in Monsters of the Multiverse, most of the core species, humans, dwarves, elves, etc., will probably see some revision and a cleaning up of the language and special mechanics. Based upon the changing of language in class abilities in the playtest, it appears that they will be eliminating magical, bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage as separate from their non-magical variants. We don't exactly know what it's going to be replaced with, but it appears that monsters will no longer have resistance to damage from bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage from non-magical attacks. Many of the classes and subclasses are going to be revised, specifically classes that had poor mechanics or were poorly received in 2014. Namely, the Monk and Ranger are getting overhauled. It appears that they are not going to be giving any classes or subclasses substantive debuffs and are instead trying to bring all of the classes up to a similar power level. Individually broken or exploitable features are seeing revision. It appears that they are trying to eliminate the long rest, short rest divide, where some classes only regain important resources on a short rest, namely the warlocks, monks, and fighters in the party, while others only regain them on a long rest, most other spellcasters and barbarians, for instance. It appears that they want to give every class at least some kind of resource back on a short rest. They've also introduced weapon masteries, which promise to give martial characters interesting tactical decisions, and which aim to create meaningful differences between weapon types. There are currently 8 different masteries, with things like Push, which allow you to push a creature 10 feet away if you hit them, or Sap, which gives a creature disadvantage on their next attack roll if you hit them. They're still playtesting weapon masteries, but based on positive feedback received, it's probably staying in. Some problem spells are going to likely see revision to try and remove must-haves and reduce trap choices. Specifically, Counterspell is getting a nerf, while spells like Jump are getting buffed so that they actually work as imagined by players. They are reintroducing the Dazed condition and rewriting some other conditions to bring them in line with the new design. Some mechanics which already exist, like being prone, are now going to be conditions. The biggest and most important change, however, is a planned integration with a virtual tabletop through DnDBeyond. Wizards of the Coast has made it clear that they intend on treating D&D not as a hobby, but as a game and a brand. They are planning on treating this new edition like a live service game, like Fortnite or your favorite MMO. According to the DnDBeyond staff, instead of brand new editions, they will focus on growing and expanding the game you love with each new product. Now, this may surprise you, but this is not the first time that they have tried to launch a new edition of D&D with a virtual tabletop integration. Now, in order to understand why they would want to revise the game at all, we need to take a look into the past of D&D to see some of the ways the hobby has changed over time. The original rules for D&D were written by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson and published in 1974 by Tactical Study Rules, or TSR. This first version is so old that in general parlance it is referred to as OD&D, or Original D&D. Looking back, it's very obvious that there have been some major changes since then, most obviously in the combat system and most of the mechanics, but some things are still the same. The same 6 stats, most of the same equipment, and the same core fantasy. Playing dwarves and elves and wizards, then called magic users, and going into dungeons to get loot, fight monsters, gain experience, and level up. In 1977, TSR would create a revised version of those rules, which in the modern parlance are referred to as the basic rules, which would be included in box sets alongside all the necessary dice and a starting adventure starting in the later 70s. In 1978, TSR published Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which is generally referred to as the first edition. One immediate difference is that Dave Arneson disappears from the cover, and we instead simply have by Gary Gygax, which gives us some clue as to why this new edition came out in the first place. Now, AD&D includes some crazy stuff, which as far as I can tell did not exist before. Here's a direct quote from the preface on page 6. You will find no pretentious dictums herein, no baseless limits arbitrarily placed on female strength or male charisma, which sounds admirable, but it is literally only 3 pages later that we get the strength chart, in which there are arbitrary limits on female strength. Looking at this chart, if you are a female halfling, you cannot have a strength above 14. In fact, this chart is chock full of arbitrary maximums and minimums, and the rest of the book is as well. Somewhat confusingly, TSR also published a revised version of those basic rules from before in 1980, in which Dave Arneson is still listed as an author. Now, this is beyond the scope of this video, but for over a decade, TSR would support 2 different versions of D&D at the same time, with similar but different rules. I will put a link to Matthew Colville's series on the history of D&D, where I got some of my information for this video if you are interested in learning more. Despite the enormous success of D&D, TSR was not doing well. It was generating tons of revenue, but had major liquidity issues, and it had crippling amounts of debt. So on October 22nd, 1985, Gary Gygax, one of the game's principal authors, who had come to be synonymous with the hobby, was forced to resign as president of TSR, and only a year later, he would leave the company altogether. I will also put a link to an article entitled The Ambush at Sheridan Springs, written by John Peterson, author of Playing at the World, if you want more information about this event and the lead up to it. Many of the underlying issues facing TSR remained, so the decision was made to release a new edition to improve the financial situation. They weren't that interested in making changes. In 1989, they released Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, 2nd edition. It was sold as more of a reorganization to D&D, and is basically backwards compatible with AD&D. It introduces several new mechanics, like non-weapon proficiencies, which would eventually evolve into skills with 3rd edition. They also introduce a new system for resolving combat called THAC0, or 2-hit armor class 0. We have to remember, of course, that for the first 26 years of the game, the lower your armor class was, the better. Now, the way combat worked prior to 2nd edition was that you would refer to a chart. Here's what it looked like in OD&D. Depending upon your class and level, you would look at a different row. You would then look at the end for the monster's AC in order to see what you needed to roll on a d20 in order to hit that monster. Now, of course, you would have to modify your result by any bonuses from a magic weapon that you may have. This was made way more complicated in AD&D, where as a sort of a patch to boost fighters, if you had a sufficiently high strength, 16 or higher, you would receive bonus damage adjustment and hit probability. Of course, in AD&D, Gary also chose to revise the chart, and we instead have this massive attack matrix, which you would have to then modify by any magic weapons and a potential hit probability bonus. Now, thankfully, THAC0 comes along and replaces this incredibly complicated and abstruse system with its own incredibly complicated and abstruse system. I think THAC0's only virtue over the charts that we had before is that it systematized things. Now, each class had its own scaling THAC0 score. Fighters had the best, but they all started at 20, and they would all go down by 1 per level, with other classes scaling somewhat less well. Your THAC0 score would then be further reduced if you had that strength hit probability bonus or a magic weapon. In combat then, you take your THAC0 score, you subtract the enemy's AC, and the result of that subtraction is the number that you need to roll on a d20 to hit that particular monster. If it's not obvious, the major issue with this system is that it requires you to do subtraction, meaning that if you screw up, if you do the second number minus the first number and not the first number minus the second one, you will get a wrong result. One thing that baffles me is that both of these early systems, the charts and this THAC0 score system, assume that a player knows what the enemy's AC is as a starting point, which seems very strange, as monster AC and hit points are traditionally secret information only the DM has. 2nd edition was unable to solve the underlying issues at TSR, and in 1997 it was acquired by Wizards of the Coast for $25 million. 3 years later, in the year 2000, they would release 3rd edition. I think aside from the original version, published in 1974, which was revolutionary in its concept, I think that 3rd edition might be the single most important edition. Throughout D&D's life, some things have stayed the same even to today, some things have stuck around for a very long time before changing, and some things were changed very quickly. For example, we still use the same 6 ability scores, but it was 3rd edition that gave us the ability score modifier. We've had armor since the beginning, but it was 3rd edition that said that your armor class gets better the higher it is. We've been rolling d20s to resolve combat since 1974, but it was 3rd edition that finally gave us a relatively straightforward system. Now, you roll a d20, you add something, compare it to a target number. If you equal or exceed, you hit. Based upon the new ability score modifier, 3rd edition also gives us skills, a ubiquitous system for resolving non-combat tasks. This is not to say that 3rd edition does not have flaws and is devoid of criticism. I think it's pretty evident that the "there's a rule for everything" style can become incredibly exhausting. Additionally, many people have complained about the prestige class system, which strongly encourages players to plan out their entire character progression well in advance and detracts from a sense of natural progression. They would revise the rules in 2003, releasing 3.5, which is still basically compatible with 3rd edition. For several reasons too complex to get into, namely Hasbro's acquisition of Wizards of the Coast in 1999, there was a pressure to transform D&D from a hobby and into a brand. The book sales model, on which D&D has traditionally relied, is only capable of generating so much revenue. So the idea, as of about 2005, is to create a virtual tabletop with several online tools, things like a character builder, and have everything bundled under a single subscription service. You may remember from earlier that Wizards of the Coast is currently trying to do the same thing with its 2024 revisions. Returning to 2005, this new edition was designed around this nascent VTT, which would help to automate large portions of the game. Unfortunately, due to a real-world tragedy, the virtual tabletop did not materialize, and when 4th edition was released in 2008, a core part of its design was missing. 4th edition is probably the most controversial edition, and as someone who has only ever known 5th, it's only somewhat evident why. It's probably the most radical version of the game. Most of its design was set aside when later designers made 5th, but one thing that is definitely present is a solution to the martial-caster divide. Going all the way back to AD&D, remember that strength buff that fighters got? There have constantly been patches to the game to try to bridge the divide, but 4E actually succeeded in making martial fighters and spellcasters equal. Now, 5E would recreate the class divide in its design, but via the universal proficiency bonus, they are on a quasi-equal footing, not really, because ultimately, eventually clerics are able to call upon divine intervention and summon extraplanar beings, while a fighter only ever gets better at swinging their sword. Now, 4E has many criticisms. I think the most common being that it was an attempt to lure in World of Warcraft fans. Now, I can't ascertain the validity of that claim, but I'm personally somewhat skeptical. I think the issue is more the framing and the lack of the virtual tabletop. 4E is explicitly heroic fantasy in a way that D&D, up until then, was not. Your abilities are all called powers, and your turn is never just, I rolled a hit, I roll for damage. 4E, like 3E, is relatively complex, with many different stacking +1s or +2s. A well-integrated virtual tabletop built around the edition would have offloaded a lot of the minutiae and sped up play significantly. One thing I can speak to as a 5e DM is that the monster design in 4e was so much better. There are literally no monsters in 4e that are essentially just a bag of hit points with an armor class and multi-attack, which unfortunately describes many 5th edition monsters. Now, whatever else was true, 4e still sold copies and generated revenue, just not nearly as much as was desired. So in 2014, Wizards of the Coast released 5e. Now, 5e has several interesting design elements, including flattened math and the proficiency bonus. The idea of bounded accuracy, or the flattened math of 5e, is that unlike some of the previous editions, namely 3rd and 4th, attack bonuses and armor classes don't scale all that much level to level. A major reason for this is that lower level monsters can still pose a challenge for higher level characters. Now, across all of the editions of D&D, there's been some element of an action economy, in which the side with the most combatants has a distinct advantage. But this is extremely pronounced in 5e, owing to bounded accuracy. A secondary element of bounded accuracy and a streamlining of the mechanics is the advantage disadvantage system. Instead of adding up +1s and +2s, most mechanical bonuses tend to grant advantage or impose disadvantage. Now there are exceptions, things like Bardic Inspiration or Bless, but those do not grant flat bonuses and instead allow you to roll an additional die on top of your d20. In 3rd edition, you had a base attack bonus, which was the main thing you would add to a d20 to determine if you hit, and it would scale linearly with level if you were a fighter. So a fighter at level 20 would add +20 to all of their attacks. Meanwhile, the proficiency bonus is that number that scales to represent this same idea, that as you go up in level, you get better. But instead of scaling from +1 to +20, it instead scales from +2 at level 1 to +3 at level 5, and so on, all the way up to the maximum of +6. I think the true innovation of 5e, though, is that this same core math applies to both saving throws and skills. All d20 tests are determined the same way. You take your relevant ability score modifier. If you are proficient, you add your proficiency bonus, which automatically scales as you level up, and the result is your total bonus. Now, one thing that I've not really been talking about up until now is style of play, because the first couple of editions are generally accepted to be pulp fantasy, where the characters are going through dungeons and are primarily motivated out of a sense of greed. Now, by the time of 3rd edition, this changes somewhat, and while it's still generally about going into dungeons and getting loot, it's not necessarily. And 4th edition totally revolutionizes things. Instead, it's heroic fantasy, where the characters are not motivated out of a sense of greed and are trying to be generally altruistic, doing good for the sake of doing good. Now, 5e is a compromise of the pulp dungeon crawl found in those first editions, and the heroic fantasy of 4e. Its compromised nature means that it's not specialized to handle either, but can do both competently. 5e has grown to become the most popular edition ever. Aside from the simplifying of the math, I think that this is mostly due to a confluence of forces, and is not wholly thanks to the virtues of 5th edition. I think it's mostly about the rise of streaming and shows like Critical Role. It does not look like the revision to the rules coming in 2024 are going to be changing any of the fundamental aspects of 5e. They're not going to be getting rid of the proficiency bonus, or ability scores, or hit points, or armor class. It's not going to be a fundamentally different game. It's still going to be the same game. They're merely rebalancing features. And I, for one, am looking forward to most of the major changes coming in the core rules. I think when it comes to the virtual tabletop integration, however, I feel a bit more trepidation. I hope that the release goes well, that there are not major technical issues, which I think might have the unfortunate consequence of leaving the edition dead on arrival like it did 4th. And I can only wonder as to what business model they will choose to go with moving forward. An a la carte subscription service, a model like Steam, where third-party creators have easy and non-draconian ways to make content available, or a closed system, where you're paying $15 or $20 a month for the privilege of playing on this new virtual tabletop. Postscript update. 2 products from Ghostfire Gaming, specifically Dungeons of Drakenheim, which I actually did a review for, check it out here, and Layers of Etheris are both available on DnDBeyond. Aside from Critical Role content, which, given their special relationship with Wizards of the Coast, I'm willing to overlook in this instance, this is the first major third-party content on DnDBeyond. I think this signals Wizards of the Coast's intention to allow third-party content on their new virtual tabletop, which is for me a huge relief. We don't exactly know what the revenue split is, or is going to look like in the future, but I'd assume somewhere in the ballpark of 80-20 to 70-30. If you remember the OGL controversy, you may remember that they were proposing a 20 to 25% royalties for any content which grossed over $750,000. I think they still want that money, but instead of the incredibly controversial royalties, they instead intend to just collect a share of all sales via D&Dbeyond, which should prove less contentious. Overall, it definitely seems like they are steering more in the direction of a platform like Steam. Who can say at this point? If you have any thoughts on the ways that D&D has changed over the years, or any thoughts on the new rules coming in 2024, feel free to include them in the comments below. All of that said, thank you guys for watching. Peace out.